I'm always on the road and often pick up hitchhikers. My only rule: they have to share the scariest story they've ever heard, and now I'm going to retell it to you. Write in the comments what city you're listening from. I may have driven by it. A body lay before me on the white snow. It was yet another victim. I felt my chest tighten with horror, not from what I saw, but from what I knew about the one who did this. I could say it was me. After all, it was my hands that dealt the death, but at the same time, it wasn't me. It was him, the spirit of the tundra, the one all the polar dwellers believed in and worshipped, and now that power lived within me. I looked at the face of the dead man, frozen in a grimace of silent terror. It seemed he understood I meant him no harm, and I hope he forgives me as others did. Henry, the hunter. I recognized him, though my memory had already blurred much of what had happened before this moment. I could barely remember how it all went down. The night melded with fragmented images, screams, blood, cold snow beneath my feet. But I knew I killed him, because it wasn't an accident. It was me. Beside me on the snow were tracks. My tracks, mingled with his bloody, bare, distorted footprints. I felt something dark and merciless whispering in my head, pushing me down this path. It was always there, looming, waiting for its chance. Now, that something controlled me. I was merely an instrument. I looked at my blood-stained hands, at the body before me. My heart pounded in my temples, each beat spreading guilt and fear through my body. Something inside me had broken, but not completely. The situation could still be salvaged, at least outwardly. I inhaled the cold air, trying to stave off the panic rising in my throat. I needed to act quickly, like before, do everything right. I'd call the sheriff, report the discovery. They'd think it happened by chance, that I had nothing to do with it. But this time, something had changed. The true nature of what was happening to me was surfacing, ready to break free. Darkness had already descended upon the forest when they found Henry. The body, covered with snow, barely touched by the last rays of the fading day, lay surrounded by a silent crowd of villagers. The snow beneath their feet had turned to gray slush, their footprints crisscrossing. Yet each person was too afraid to step closer. They were gripped by the same fear that stirred within me as I looked at the body. I stood apart, feeling the forest shadows pressing in from all sides. But that wasn't the worst of it. The worst part was that I knew I had killed him. Every look, every move from the crowd was directed at me. They feared not only what had happened to Henry, but also me, and perhaps they were right. The wind rustled through the treetops, carrying faint, almost whispering sounds that, along with the soft crackling of branches, resembled voices murmuring about the horrors of this place. The forest watched in silence. I could feel it on my skin. An old hunter stepped out from the crowd, his eyes piercing me with a suspicion so intense it seemed he saw something the others only guessed at. His face was twisted with tension, and the silence was so heavy it was almost tangible. He said nothing, but his look conveyed more than any words could. He knew, and that look began to draw the attention of everyone else. Glances that had only skimmed over me a moment ago were now fixed with an undeniable suspicion growing ever stronger. The sheriff tried to take control of the situation. He stepped forward, placing a hand on the hunter's shoulder, trying to calm him down. But the old man didn't respond. The hunter's fear spread through the crowd like poison, causing people to murmur their thoughts, doubts, and suspicions to one another. Their gazes gradually turned into something darker, more menacing. I could feel it, their fear mixing with hatred. Silence enveloped me, but it was the kind of silence that precedes a storm. The sheriff looked at me again. He tried to hide his own distrust, but his eyes betrayed his true feelings. His words were empty, like speeches spoken on autopilot. He demanded calm from the crowd, but they were no longer listening. They looked at me as if I were the cause of everything that had happened. I felt cold sweat trickle down my back. The sheriff's words no longer mattered. I saw their faces filling with fear, with that fear turning into something more sinister, a desire to find someone to blame. And suddenly, something in the crowd shifted. The anxiety that had been nesting in their eyes started to grow, like a wildfire. Each of them was searching for an answer in me, one they feared to accept as truth. The tension pressed down on me, tightening from all sides. The air felt heavier, each breath coming with difficulty, as if something sharp and unbearable were lodged in my throat. I felt their gazes, cold, sharp, like blades, tearing me to pieces. My heart was pounding so loudly I was certain they could hear it too, but I couldn't move. I just stood there paralyzed by their eyes, their fear, and in that moment, I understood. They knew. Maybe not all of them, but some had begun to suspect. They didn't need evidence. The feeling was enough. Something primal, invisible hung in the air, and they sensed it just as I did. It was like a shadow growing more real, darker, with each passing second. I stood there, among that crowd, watching them, thinking of only one thing: how everything had changed in just a day, how quickly that fear had turned me into an outsider, an enemy, how I had become the center of this horror. And in that moment, a bitter, searing regret overwhelmed me. I realized that if I hadn't gone into the forest yesterday, none of this would have happened. When I came to Fort Severn, it was the result of persistent requests and plans from my research center. We had a mission to study the effects of climate change on the ecosystem in this remote corner of Canada. Fort Severn, nestled deep in the Arctic cold, was the perfect place to observe how rising temperatures would affect the flora and fauna, especially as animals' and plants' habits began to shift. We were also studying how humans interact with nature in such extreme conditions. Upon my arrival, the meeting with the locals was far from welcoming. They, the Cree people, were troubled by my presence. Nearly all of them believed that my interference with nature might awaken evil spirits or lead to unwanted consequences. Local legends spoke of how outsiders could disrupt the balance held by nature, which might awaken ancient spirits best left undisturbed. I settled in Fort Severn, a small community amid the icy expanse, trying to ignore their warnings and focus on my work. This settlement was fortified like a bastion in the harsh cold, with small wooden houses and a limited population. I tried to integrate, but the distrust surrounding me was not only obvious, but deeply unsettling. Every day when I woke and looked out at the frozen wilderness beyond the window, I felt that my presence here was more than just a study of nature. It was an invasion of something meant to remain untouched. That morning, I headed into the forest, trying to deal with my own emotions. The sun had just begun to rise, and the first rays gently diffused the mist over the snowy landscape, but I felt neither joy nor relief at this dawn. My heart was clenched with unease, my thoughts tangled around the strange events of recent days. The entire forest breathed with something unknown, silent, and ominous. I walked toward the forest, hoping for a distraction, but instead, I encountered something that made me freeze. In a clearing near the house I'd passed, an old tree, bathed in the first light, was covered with birds. They perched on the branches like silent judges, black and motionless. They were ravens, or perhaps something more than just ravens. Their sharp beaks gleamed, and their eyes, black and gleaming, were fixed on me. They were so still that even the wind sliding through the trees didn't move them. It was a frightening, eerie silence that I felt with my whole body. It seemed the forest itself was holding its breath, waiting for something. I approached slowly, trying to calm my heart, pounding in my chest like a madman. Each of my steps echoed dully in the silence, and with every step, a desperate fear grew. Cold gripped my body, though I could no longer feel it. Only this strange sense of impending danger closing in, and then it happened. Without warning, the ravens took off from the branches, and their horrifying cries pierced the silent morning. It was a sound I had never heard before, as if the very air screamed in pain. The birds swirled into a vortex, creating a black curtain that covered the sky above my head. I couldn't understand what was happening. Everything around me spun in a wild dance of black wings. They thrashed against each other like mad creatures, and with each new strike, a feeling of doom intensified. I stood, trying to shield my face with my hands, but the birds broke through that barrier, their beaks and claws tearing at my clothes and skin. They ripped at my clothing, their talons leaving painful cuts on my face and arms. My hat flew off my head, exposing me to their furious attack. I tried to fend them off, but their onslaught was relentless. Black wings engulfed me from all sides, creating a feeling of utter helplessness. The silence felt alive, squeezing my mind, making my nerves tremble. I spun around, trying to see anything through this impenetrable veil, and then, sharp, piercing pain exploded in my head, like someone struck me with a hammer. It was so sudden and intense that my legs buckled, and I fell face first into the cold snow. My flashlight slipped from my hands, but I didn't feel it roll away into the darkness. The pain consumed my entire consciousness. My body felt paralyzed. I lay on the icy ground, and fragmented visions began to appear before my eyes. These weren't just images. They were something ancient, dark, foreign, flashes of another life, another time. At first, they seemed random. Faces, landscapes, fire that engulfed everything around it. I saw figures, people dancing around a bonfire, their eyes gleaming in the dark, their movements too fast, too wild. They sang, they whispered, and that whisper was the same one that had been haunting me all this time. I tried to break free, to force myself not to see, to close my eyes, but each new fragment only plunged me deeper into this nightmare. The images became clearer, and the feeling of losing my grasp on reality grew stronger. Now I saw trees, the very trees surrounding me, but they were different. They stood as silent witnesses to some ancient ritual that took place long before people ever arrived here. It felt as if I were reliving these moments, as though I'd been pulled into another dimension of time where I was no longer myself. And then the truth began to manifest before my eyes. I saw how those same people, those same figures standing in a circle around the fire, weren't just dancing, they were making a sacrifice. None of them said a word, but their faces expressed boundless cruelty. The fire licked at their shadows, making them appear larger, more terrifying than they truly were. And then I saw it, a shadow of a wolf bending toward them from the darkness, as vast as the night itself. I felt the earth beneath me begin to move. It trembled, as if reacting to these images, and my heart began to race faster. I understood that this wasn't just a vision, not something abstract. It was the real past, real events that had unfolded here, in this very place. I didn't know how, but I felt that this was not just ancient history. It was a secret I had awakened by coming here. The darkness that surrounded me was not just night. It was part of that ritual, part of that sacrifice, and now it was pulling me toward it. It sought to consume me. I tried to scream, but no sound escaped my throat. My hands trembled, clutching at the snow, which no longer felt cold. It seemed as if my entire body was slowly dissolving into this infernal whirlpool of images. Then, as abruptly as it had begun, it was over. The ravens shot up into the sky, vanishing, leaving me lying on the snow, wounded and exhausted. My clothes were torn, my skin burned with pain, red streaks of blood mixing with the white snow, as if nature itself wanted to erase me from this scene. I lay there, breathing heavily, unable to comprehend what had just happened. My legs carried me further into the forest on their own, though my mind insisted I should stop. The snow underfoot crunched heavily, its sound echoing between the trees, creating the illusion that I was not alone here. The tension in the air only intensified. The forest was quiet, but not peaceful. Its silence was loaded with anticipation, and suddenly, I saw it, a silhouette among the trees, standing motionless in the distance. I squinted and realized it was a wolf. Its form stood out against the snowy forest, and it remained there, as if waiting for me. Its eyes, cold and watchful, glinted ominously in the dim light, and I felt a chill run down my spine. It didn't move, didn't growl, it just stared, piercing me with its gaze. There were only a few meters between us, but it was enough to understand this was no ordinary wolf. Something dark, ancient, and sinister stood before me. Its presence felt like a part of this ominous forest, which had repeatedly given me the feeling that I didn't belong here. I took a step back, never breaking eye contact with the wolf. Though it stayed in place, its gaze continued to follow me, piercing deep into my soul. Something about it was wrong, too human. This was not just a beast, it was something more, and that something was waiting for me. With each step back, the feeling of dread became unbearable. The forest, the ravens, that wolf, they all blended into one vast horror, engulfing me, leaving nothing but cold and a deep tremor within my soul. The wolf hadn't moved, and that frightened me most. I expected something, a growl, a leap, any sound, but it simply stood there, silent and motionless, its eyes fixed on me like prey. I tried to keep my composure and continued moving slowly forward, feeling its gaze on me. Every step felt heavy, as if my feet were sinking into the snow. Time seemed to slow, and this moment stretched into eternity. I took a few more steps, my eyes never leaving the wolf, and then it simply vanished. One blink, and it was gone. The silence of the forest seemed to grow louder, its unbearable emptiness pressing in from all sides. I stopped, looking around. Nothing appeared to have changed, yet everything felt different. The forest had become foreign. There was something invisible within it, something just waiting to reveal itself. I kept walking. Now every snap of a branch or creak of snow made me flinch. But the worst part was knowing that the wolf wasn't the only one watching me. Shadows constantly flickered at the edges of my vision. I saw figures gliding between the trees in the distance. Foxes, deer, or perhaps wolves again. I couldn't be sure, but their eyes glinted in the twilight from time to time. They were too close, too calm, too fearless. It was uncharacteristic of the wilderness. The animals appeared and disappeared, leaving a constant sense of being observed. None of them approached closer, but they didn't vanish entirely either. They lingered, moving between the trees, sliding in the shadows, maintaining a certain distance as if testing my reaction. I felt the cold creeping all the way into my heart. Something was wrong. I no longer felt in control. The surroundings now dictated their own rules. My presence here was unwelcome, and the forest felt it. My work seemed pointless, as though there was no sense in studying this place. Only a suffocating fear grew with each passing minute. It felt as though something unseen was guiding my steps, taking away any sense of control. And once again, a throbbing pain tore through my head, pulsing with each step in the snow. At first, I tried to ignore it, explaining it away as sleep deprivation or the aftermath of yesterday's events. But the pain intensified, becoming unbearable. A veil seemed to cloud my vision, making every step heavier and less certain. I felt something press from within, throwing me off balance. It seemed as if the entire world around me was losing clarity. The longer I stayed in the forest, the stronger this strange sensation grew. Not just that I was being watched, but controlled. My steps became heavy, as though my feet were sinking into the snow. It was hard to breathe, and even the familiar sounds of the forest, the rustling wind, the crackling branches, merged into a chaotic hum in my head. Finally, unable to endure the oppressive feeling any longer, I decided to end my work sooner than planned. Although the day had only begun, I no longer wanted to remain here. I quickly gathered my equipment and hurried back toward the village. Each step back felt lighter, as if the forest was finally releasing me, but it hadn't let me go. Shadows behind the trees still lingered. As I neared the village, a sense of relief washed over me. It felt as though this place offered me some protection. I was suddenly overcome with hunger and decided to stop at a cafe for a bite. Yet even there, I felt something amiss, as if a part of the forest, its cold and darkness, had followed me. Just as I approached the small cafe where I usually stopped for breakfast, my attempts to escape the terror that pursued me proved futile. Suddenly, as if in response to my fears, shattering the frosty calm of the morning, I heard a piercing, horrifying scream. It sent a chill deep into my bones. It took me a moment to realize where the scream was coming from, but by then, it was too late. I turned and saw a scene filled with horror. Walking along the road past the cafe was a woman, far older than her appearance suggested. Her long gray hair unraveled in the wind, her hands trembling like aspen leaves. Her face was twisted with pain and fear, her eyes red and tear-streaked, her lips moving constantly in a soundless scream. Trails of tears and blood streaked down her cheeks as she sobbed loudly, desperately trying to turn away from the terrifying reality. A tall man followed behind her, dark-haired with deep, shadowy eyes. He was carrying the body of a young woman, wrapped in an oversized men's jacket that seemed far too big for her slight frame. The body appeared lifeless, limbs dangling with a sickly bluish hue, slicing through the icy snow with each step. It even seemed as though the jacket itself, draped over the girl, had twisted into some kind of vortex of cold and fear. The girl's body was deeply unsettling, and every movement seemed filled with torment, as if she bore a heavy secret that refused to be laid to rest. I could see blue-tinged fingers emerging from beneath the jacket, and her sallow, frigid skin. The entire scene felt like some dark ritual or incantation. As it turned out, this girl had disappeared from her own bed last night. Her body was found at dawn, near the water, lifeless and covered in frost. It was discovered she'd died from the cold, a horrifying fact that turned my world upside down. I couldn't tear my eyes away from this horror, and with every second that passed, my heart pounded faster. The scene before me felt like a sinister rupture in reality, defying all boundaries of human understanding. Rubbing my hands together, I adjusted my glasses over and over, as if they could somehow capture the full terror unfolding before me. I felt my body twitching from the cold that seeped not only into my bones, but into my soul. My nerves were on edge, and fear filled every part of my being. I took a few steps back and hurried inside the cafe, silently praying for peace, which now seemed like a distant dream in the face of this relentless horror that hadn't left me for a moment. I rushed into the cafe, barely closing the door behind me. Inside it was warm, but the sluggish, stifling atmosphere brought no relief. The locals sat silently at their tables, staring into their coffee cups or out the windows, as if searching for answers to something unspoken. Today, everything felt different. They seemed reluctant to be here, yet afraid to be alone. Over the past few weeks, the forest had turned strange, dark, and silent. First, those ominous ravens, then the death of the young girl found by the river, now Henry. And I knew the truth. I was part of this, even if no one suspected it yet. But they sensed something. I took a seat in the far corner, pretending to find solace in a cup of hot tea. Its taste was bitter and metallic, but I drank because my hands needed to be occupied. Each sip tried to quell the anxiety growing inside me, but it didn't help. I could feel their gazes on me. They watched, though they tried not to show it. Someone couldn't resist a quick, tense glance, while others whispered covertly. The silence in the cafe was tense, brittle. I couldn't take it. Maintaining a detached demeanor, I quickly got up and left. Once again, the forest. Gray twilight hung over the village, and the heavy sky seemed to press down on my shoulders, making it harder to breathe. I walked home, hoping that four walls might help me escape the horrifying thoughts spiraling around recent events. But my mind kept dragging me back to that morning in the forest, to everything that had happened before. Something had changed in that forest. I locked the door, turned on the light, and sat at the table. Leaning back, I tried to focus on my work, but my hands were shaking. Fragments of the events that had unsettled me swirled continuously in my mind. Something wouldn't let me go. Something whispered deep inside me. And then the whisper returned, only this time it wasn't in my consciousness. I froze, listening. A faint sound, barely perceptible, seeped into the room through the walls. Or, no, it seemed to be inside my head. This wasn't like external noise. The whisper was clear, though not immediately decipherable. My heart began to beat faster in my chest. Listening more intently, I suddenly realized it was in the locals' dialect. I'd heard it before, during their rituals, when the elders gathered around the fire. The whisper rang cold in my ears and a chill ran down my spine. My first thought was that someone had decided to play a cruel trick, to frighten me. After all, they'd always looked at me with suspicion. The outsider, the scientist, studying what couldn't be explained by their ancient beliefs. But after a day like today, after all these terrifying events, I was in no mood for jokes. I shot up and went out into the dark, not even grabbing my coat. The cold wind hit me instantly, biting sharply into my skin. I was ready to voice my anger, but I froze in place. There was no one around, empty, only silence and the howling wind between the trees. But the whispering didn't stop. I could still hear it, though now it seemed closer, almost brushing against my ears. I turned around, searching for the source of the sound, but only darkness stretched before me. The forest stood silent, like a predator waiting for the perfect moment to strike. My nerves were stretched to the breaking point. My mind could no longer distinguish where the sound was coming from, behind the trees, or perhaps from somewhere deep within my own mind. Every step back, every attempt to take a full breath felt futile. The whispering wouldn't stop. It only grew louder, seeping inside, blending words into a haunting, endless chorus. I stood there, unable to move forward or back, because I understood something or someone was close. It was more than a feeling. It was a pulsating fear, drawing nearer with each breath. And then I heard footsteps. No, it couldn't be. Someone was following me, not bothering to hide. Raising my head, I noticed something flickering in the depths of the trees, a faint light that immediately captured my attention. Everything in me paused for a moment, and the whispering seemed to drown out everything else. I stared into that spot between the trees, where the light flickered like a tiny flame in the wind. What was it? Who was it? Could it be the local Cree people? I'd heard of their rituals, which they usually conducted under the cover of night, hidden from prying eyes. They'd always kept their distance from me, treating me with suspicion. Perhaps now I had a chance to see what they had kept so carefully concealed? I seized this thought almost eagerly. Finally, I might learn more about them, penetrate their secrets, understand what they were hiding from me. I quickly dressed, grabbed my camera, and dashed outside, barely noticing the cold. Night had cloaked the forest, but I followed that faint flicker, drawing me deeper into the thicket. As I made my way through the forest, every step felt heavier. The darkness wrapped around me, as if nature itself were trying to hold me back. The footsteps behind me began again, dull, rhythmic, as though someone was trailing me. Yet every time I looked back, there was no one there. The light still flickered ahead, like a beacon in a sea of darkness. My breathing grew louder, as if right behind me. My lungs struggled for air, my heart beating so loudly it seemed to drown out everything around. I quickened my pace, nearly running, trying to catch up to the light, but it seemed to be playing some strange game with me. The whispering now filled every corner of my mind, but through it all, I could only hear one thing. The footsteps behind grew louder, and then I realized the darkness itself was chasing me. Not people, not animals, something else. Something far older and more dangerous was slowly pulling me deeper into the forest. The light flickered once more ahead, and driven by a desire to understand, to see, to get closer, I ran a few more meters. At last, I reached a small clearing illuminated by a faint glow. The light suddenly went out, as if it had never been there. Darkness swallowed everything around, and I stopped abruptly, finding myself in a dim silence. The wind that lazily drifted through the trees had ceased, leaving only a strange and chilling emptiness. I pulled a small flashlight from my pocket and aimed its beam forward, but the darkness felt unnatural. It didn't dissipate, rather it thickened around me, absorbing all light, as if the night itself lived and breathed, enveloping me in its unseen, suffocating shroud. And suddenly everything stopped. The pain in my head flared with new intensity, and I remembered everything. I saw her before me, a girl in a long white shirt, her shadowy figure barely visible through the darkness. My heart clenched as I recognized her. It was her, the one they'd carried down the street earlier. My head spun with these memories. Just like on that day when I barely dragged myself home, everything then had felt unbearably strange. My vision blurred, my thoughts tangled, and inside, something churned, boiled, like a fire I couldn't put out. Then when I saw her by the water, she'd been sitting on a blanket, wrapped in her warm clothing, as if praying. I froze, unwittingly standing still, watching her, and suddenly felt her lift her head, sensing my gaze. Her eyes met mine, and I saw fear grip her. She sprang up, clutching her clothes to her chest, and began to speak quickly. Her words were lost in the darkness. I couldn't understand them. She stepped back, and I saw her trembling, but at that moment I felt nothing. Only a strange warmth growing in my chest. It was as if I'd lost myself. The world around me faded. She was all that remained. I didn't hear her pleas, didn't see her fear. All that existed for me in that moment was the need to move forward, toward her. Something controlled me. I became a mere observer in my own body, which moved on its own. I moved closer, and with each of her steps back, this incomprehensible fire within me only grew. Her eyes widened with terror, and suddenly she screamed. That scream pierced through my stupor, but only for a moment. Then I lunged at her like a predator after its prey. She tried to escape, but I caught up with her in just a few steps, and then I was there, grabbing her throat with my hands wrapped around her neck, at first lightly, as if testing my strength, then tighter, feeling her body tense, fighting for life. Her gasps mingled with my own breath, but I didn't stop. I kept squeezing. What was happening to me? I didn't want this, but something within me pushed further, harder. Her face changed. First it flushed, then grew pale, her eyes glazing over. I felt the life leaving her body, and at the same time, something strange was happening to me. This wild, burning sensation grew and consumed me completely. When she finally stopped breathing, I felt something inside me subside. The fire that had raged within me vanished abruptly, leaving only emptiness. I released her body, and it collapsed to the ground. I stood there, looking down at her. My hands still trembled, but I no longer felt that power, that dark force that had controlled me. I stepped back, one foot after another, never taking my eyes off her. What had I done? Horror began to penetrate my consciousness. This wasn't me. This was something else. The girl's body remained on the ground, and without a second glance, I turned and walked back toward the cafe. Step by step, I returned to reality, feeling that unbearable sense of power and pressure inside me fade. With each step, I felt lighter, but the horror and understanding of what I had just done lingered. And now, here, in the darkness, those memories rushed over me again, like a wave. I saw it again and again, as if it had just happened. I could feel her throat beneath my hands. I could see her face. I could see life leaving her body. And now, realizing it all, I felt the horror that enveloped me completely. What was happening to me? What had I done? I sat, paralyzed with horror, trying to piece together the events that had unfolded around me. My heart pounded, and my mind resisted accepting the reality of what I had just felt and seen. This couldn't be true, yet the girl's face, her wide, terrified eyes pleading for mercy, kept flashing before my eyes. How could I have done this? What had driven this madness into me? I was feverish. Everything inside felt foreign and yet strangely familiar. I was a killer, and this thought hammered in my head, drowning out even my own emotions. My mind struggled to comprehend how this could have happened at all. Amid the chaos of thoughts, filled with despair and fear, one seemingly insignificant detail pierced through. It was my first day in Fort Severn. I'd been standing on the street waiting for instructions before heading into the forest when an old man approached me, his face wrinkled and etched with deep lines of age. His eyes held a haunting wisdom. He came so quietly that I hadn't noticed his presence until I felt a light touch on my shoulder. The old man warned me about the forest, saying that ancient spirits slept there, which could awaken from the interference of outsiders. His words had seemed to me then like mere stories, local legends, a naive myth meant to frighten people like me. I didn't take it seriously, thinking the old man was simply trying to uphold the traditions and beliefs of his people. But now, sitting on the cold ground in the silence and darkness that surrounded me, I no longer found it funny. I felt a terrifying chill penetrating my soul. Could the old man have been right? Could these spirits truly exist? And was it they who forced me to do what I did? The memories of the moment when I killed the girl became even more horrifying. I saw her struggling in vain for her life, her fingers desperately trying to break free from my hands that gripped her throat. It was as if some incomprehensible force inside me compelled me to continue. The nature I had come to study now seemed to me an enemy that had awakened the darkness within me. Everything that had happened recently, the whispers in the forest, the shadows, the ravens, and now this murder, all seemed like a cruel game of powers that existed beyond human understanding. Perhaps the ancient spirits the man had warned me about had truly been awakened by my intrusion. My body trembled from the cold and fear. I rose to my knees, feeling the icy ground seep slowly through my clothes. Yet this physical cold was nothing compared to the terror that pierced me from within. I could no longer deny it. Something in the forest, something ancient and dark, had entered my life, and now I stood on the edge of madness, gripped by horror and trembling. I couldn't stay there another minute. The cold ground beneath me felt like a trap, and the darkness pressed in from all sides as if something unseen was holding me back, refusing to let me escape. But instinct took over, and shaky and weakened, I got to my feet. My mind was muddled, but one thing was clear. I needed help. By dawn, I stumbled upon a familiar place. It was where Henry, the old hunter who was one of the few to keep in contact with me, often spent his time. He didn't believe in all the local superstitions, and always said that to him, the forest was just a forest. Perhaps he could help me, explain what was happening to me. I followed the path leading to his small cabin. It was already dawn, and the fog blanketing everything around made the forest even more eerie. Each step was heavy, but the thought of seeing Henry urged me forward. As I approached his home, I managed to see a faint plume of smoke rising from the chimney. I moved closer to the door, ready to knock, when suddenly that same heat flared up within me. a familiar burning warmth that had already overtaken my body before. It rose from my chest, igniting every nerve, making my heart pound with impossible force. It was happening again. My vision blurred, and I took a step back. Panic began to overwhelm me, screaming inside my head, "No, not again!" But it didn't matter anymore. I saw the door open, and there stood Henry, the old hunter with weary eyes. He looked at me and sensed something was wrong immediately. I tried to shout to him, to warn him to run, but no words came out. The heat only intensified, numbing my body, and my legs began moving forward as if I no longer controlled them. Henry stood there, looking at me with confusion, perhaps even with worry, but he had no chance to escape. I wanted to stop myself, to resist this horrific urge, but everything within me turned against my will. My hands lifted, and the heat that consumed me now controlled my every movement. It was the same force that had made me kill that girl. Now it demanded a new victim, and there was no way to resist. Henry stood on the doorstep, his face twisting in fear as he finally realized the danger approaching. His eyes widened, and he reflexively took a step back. But it was futile. The fire inside me had fully seized control of my body. I lunged at him in an instant, like a predator after its prey. My hands shot out, gripping his neck, my fingers tightening with such force that the joints cracked. His breathing turned to rasping gasps, his eyes rolling back as he struggled, helplessly flailing his hands. I felt his warm, pulsing skin beneath my palms, still alive, but it didn't matter. My hands clenched his throat tighter, and I felt the brittle cartilage begin to give under my fingers. His mouth opened, trying to suck in air, but it was all in vain. I couldn't stop. His knees suddenly buckled, and Henry sank to the ground, his body limp under the weight of my hands. Time seemed to slow, and I saw a thin trickle of blood appear at the corner of his mouth, curling into a dark, thick stream. Henry let out one final rasp. His chest shuddered, and then everything went still. When his body finally went completely slack, I stood over him, feeling the heat within me slowly recede. My hands released their grip, and Henry collapsed onto the snow, which was instantly stained dark red around his neck. My heart still pounded wildly, but the force controlling me was beginning to fade. The sound of blood dripping onto the snow seemed eerily quiet in the surrounding silence. And there I stood beside Henry's body, frozen and nervously observing the villagers around me. Suddenly, something in the crowd shifted. The anxiety that had been lurking in their eyes began to grow like a fire about to rage out of control. Each of them was searching for an answer in me, one they feared to accept as truth. The tension pressed down on me from all sides, tightening like a noose. The air felt thicker, each breath becoming harder, as if some invisible force was gripping my throat, making every breath painful and sharp. I felt their gazes, cold, sharp, like blades, tearing me apart. My heart pounded so loudly that I was certain they could hear it too, but my body refused to obey. I was paralyzed by their fear, by their accusations, and then I understood they already knew. Maybe not all of them, but some had already guessed. They didn't need evidence. They sensed it instinctively, just as I did. It was like a shadow, growing more real, darker, and drawing closer with each passing minute. I stood, petrified in the midst of that crowd, thinking only of how everything had changed in a single day, how fear and hatred had turned me into an outsider, an enemy, how I had become the center of this horror. And at that moment, a bitter, searing regret washed over me. If only I hadn't gone into the forest that day, all of this could have been avoided. Killer, the word wasn't the first, but its echo sliced through the air like a knife. Someone lunged forward. One of them shoved me in the chest, and I staggered back, feeling a sudden pain sear through my body. A blow followed to my face. The crowd seemed to go wild. One after another, they rushed at me. I saw their faces, contorted with fear and hatred. They didn't see me. They saw only an enemy, a monster. A burning pain flooded my body, but I couldn't defend myself. I couldn't, because I didn't understand what was happening. Blows rained down from all sides, fists, kicks, screams blending into a single roar. I felt hot blood trickling from my lip, my eyebrows splitting open, but the pain felt distant, muted. I tried to say something, to open my mouth, but the words stuck in my throat. I was paralyzed, trapped. Each new blow brought a fresh wave of terror. People shouted, pushed, hit me, but none of it mattered anymore. My mind froze on a single thought. I had to escape. I had to get out of there. Gathering every ounce of strength, I tried to break free from the chaos. The crowd's pressure weighed on me from all sides, but in a brief moment, I managed to elbow someone and push forward. I felt air filling my lungs, though it, too, felt heavy. Step by step, I fought through the crowd, through blows and shoves. The sheriff tried to restrain the people, but the situation had spiraled out of control. At last, I broke through to the edge of the crowd. Someone tried to grab my jacket, but I jerked forward and ran. Snow kicked up beneath my feet. Cold wind cut into my face. But I ran as though death itself chased me. I didn't think about direction, didn't think about the pain. Only one thought pulsed in my head: get home. When I finally arrived home, my mind was racing. I paced the room back and forth like a cornered animal, unable to stop or focus. My feet nervously tapped across the floor, echoing the frantic rhythm of my inner panic. The furniture, things I saw every day, now felt like they were trapping me. What to do? Where to go? Questions swarmed in my mind with no answers. I couldn't understand what was happening or how everything had gone so wrong. The anger and rage I felt built within me like a fire, growing stronger with each passing moment. Looking out the window, I saw figures gathering outside. Their shapes were barely visible through the snow and twilight, but I already knew who they were. They had come for me. There weren't many at first, just a few figures, but I saw the crowd slowly growing. Some stood at a distance, others moved closer to the door. I recognized the hunter who had always looked at me with distrust. Now his suspicions were open. I saw it in his eyes. He had decided that he knew the truth. Rage seethed inside me, pulsing in my temples. They were the reason all this happened, yet they blamed me. The resentment grew, turning into something more, almost uncontrollable. I yanked open the closet, throwing things into a bag as quickly as I could. My body shook with nerves, and I dropped items to the floor more than once. They demanded my disappearance, and it was the only thing I could do to avoid catastrophe. A heavy knock sounded on the door, loud and resolute, like the blow of a hammer. I flinched, staring at the door. Their voices seeped through, distant but dripping with hostility and hatred. They wanted me, demanded my presence. My hands trembled, and my heart began to beat even faster. The pounding on the door grew louder, each hollow thud echoing in my temples. I could hear them standing outside the door, their voices blending into a malicious chorus. The tension closed in on me like hooks pulling from all directions. Every shout, every knock on the door sent a fresh wave of terror and anger surging through me. Among them was the hunter, the one who always looked at me with suspicion. He wasn't alone. Other townsfolk were there, closing in on me slowly, steadily. Their eyes burned with a dark fire, and I knew these people would not leave until they saw my blood. The hunter took a step forward, and I felt something crack within me. Darkness surged, and once again, that heat consumed my entire body. I stood still, watching through the window as people gathered outside the house. Their voices grew louder, merging into a stream of threats and malice, like a sinister choir. They spoke to one another, but each word felt like a knife aimed at my back. Among them was the hunter, the same man who had always eyed me with distrust. Now his gaze burned even hotter, piercing me through the glass, though I stood in the shadows. He wasn't alone. Others flanked him, moving like a pack of predators surrounding the house. I waited, expecting the sheriff to intervene, to stop this chaos, but he was nowhere to be seen. Even when his figure finally appeared at the edge of the crowd, he didn't move. He wasn't going to step in. He simply stood there, silently watching as this frenzy overtook everyone around him. There would be no rescue, and I realized that when our eyes met. There was no sympathy in his gaze, no understanding, only a quiet agreement with what was about to unfold. My heart clenched. My mind raced for an escape, but there was none. Suddenly, a sharp sound of shattering glass sent chills down my spine. Shards scattered across the room, tiny fragments of impending threat, and it was only the beginning. Within seconds, I heard a crackle, accompanied by the acrid, piercing smell of smoke. Something lit had been thrown into the house, and now flames began licking across the room. I watched as fire spread across the floor, devouring everything in its path, and with each moment, the sense of impending doom grew. The heat I felt outside mirrored the one rising within me. The darkness, long rooted inside, began to bubble like an avalanche, ready to cascade down. The entity that had lingered on the fringes of my mind now acted with intent, each heartbeat intensifying its grip on my consciousness. Its rage, its fury, all of it filled me, threatening to break free. I began pacing the room nervously, attempting to gather my things, but my hands shook uncontrollably. Sharp waves of fear and anger washed over me, making each movement heavy and unbearable. The fire continued to consume the house, transforming the room into a hellish blaze. The flames spread so quickly that I could barely see an exit. My breathing grew ragged, every inhale burning my lungs. The darkness within me swelled, squeezing my consciousness like iron chains. The entity unfurled within, like a predatory beast that had finally found its moment to strike. I could feel it clawing its way into my mind, trying to break free and take control of my body. I struggled against it, tried to keep my mind clear, but it was a losing battle. Its hatred and cruelty churned inside me, like molten metal ready to melt me from within. My rage, fear, and despair twisted into a single knot. I couldn't understand what to do next. There was no escape. I had nowhere to run, no one to turn to for help. And when the heat filled my body to the brim, the darkness finally took over. My consciousness seemed to dissolve in a thick haze. The last thing I remembered was my hands opening the door, the crowd freezing for an instant. Then their scream echoed out. When I came to, an eerie silence hung around me. Snow lay thick and heavy beneath my feet, like a shroud covering the dead earth. But this wasn't ordinary snow. Its white surface was marred by dark stains, which with each step grew more and more like blood. Everything around me was dead. I stood among corpses, as if in the very heart of a nightmare, and it felt as though the world had come to a halt. A cold wind blew from the north, as if trying to cleanse the land, but all that remained were lifeless bodies scattered in chaotic disarray. My eyes slowly focused, revealing a horrifying sight before me. They lay around me. All the people I'd seen every day, the townspeople who had stood outside my house just moments ago shouting, were now dead. Their eyes remained open, frozen in terror at the moment of their last scream. Some of them were familiar. The hunter who always looked at me with suspicion now lay twisted in an unnatural position, his face contorted in an agonizing grimace. A feeling of dread rose to my throat, choking me. I couldn't understand how it had happened. What had I done? What had turned me into a monster capable of destroying everyone around me? My hands trembled, still seemingly feeling the remnants of their blood, their pain. I looked at these bodies and felt shame and anguish tightening around my heart. Something inside me, this darkness, this terrifying fire, had won again. I couldn't control it, and that realization chilled me to the bone. The fear of my own strength was stronger than any fear I had ever felt. Each corpse, each frozen body lying in the snow, seemed to accuse me of my guilt. Every step felt heavy, as if I were buried under the weight of my own crimes. Someone might think they got what they deserved, but I knew I had no right to decide who lived and who died. The horror of my destructive power gripped me, an uncontrollable force I could no longer command. Pain and shame burned within, eating away at me from the inside. I looked at my hands, the same hands that had recently tightened around Henry's throat, the same hands that had brought death and ruin. The fire within me had subsided, leaving only a cold emptiness. I couldn't stay here any longer. I couldn't risk this happening again. I had to disappear as quickly as possible. I rushed back to the house, where I'd already packed what I intended to take with me earlier. My body shook, but my hands worked quickly, almost automatically, grabbing everything that could fit in my backpack. Every item I packed felt like the last reminder of a life that was now left behind. When I was ready, I threw the backpack over my shoulders and, without looking back, headed for the door. Snow continued to fall, but now it felt colder, piercing, as if the heavens themselves wept for the lives lost. I looked around, checking if anyone was left alive, but there was no one, only dead bodies and white drifts. I didn't know if anyone had survived, or if anyone had witnessed what happened, but I couldn't take the risk. I had to run, for if I stayed, there would be nothing left but death. I turned to the forest, deciding to go far away from this place. The forest called to me, dark and unknown. But there I could disappear. There I could be alone, where no one would see me as I had become. I decided to leave a warning for anyone who might read these words, my final message, my testimony to what happened here. I don't know if this will save anyone, but it's the only thing I can do. My hands shake as I write these last lines, and my mind is in chaos. Maybe it's already too late. Maybe no one will read this warning, but I have to try. I thought it was just an experiment, science, research on climate change and its impact on nature. I believed in rational explanations for everything that was happening, but that was only a cover, a surface layer hiding something deeper and older, lurking in the darkness, something that should never have been uncovered. And now I understand. I brought this evil here myself. Every sound in this forest, every shadow, every cold breath of wind, it has all become part of something I can no longer explain. I sought answers, but found only fear. There is something that lives here, in these woods, and now it has become a part of me. I see it in my thoughts, feel it in my every move. It lives within me, reaching for my mind, craving more. And with each passing minute, I realize that I am no longer myself. I sent my notes to the center. Maybe someone will receive them and read them. Maybe this will warn those who dare to come here. But you must know one thing: do not come here. This place no longer belongs to humanity. There is something here that cannot be explained, and when it finds you, there will be no return. I thought it was a scientific phenomenon, but it is something more, something that lives in the darkness, and now it lives within me. Do not come here. This is no longer a place for people. Now, let me share a moment from my life. I am an artist, and oil painting is both exciting and relaxing for me. About 8 years ago, I became so passionate about oil painting that I earned a Bachelor of Arts and now work as an art restorer in Barcelona. One day, I looked back and realized what knowledge I needed when I first started. So I prepared an intensive course of 14 visual and practical lessons for you. No talking heads or unnecessary chatter, just rich content that is immediately applicable in practice, all for the price of 1 day of car rental. Art therapy is a great way to cope with your anxieties. Link in profile or description.